Hi, folks. This is Abel James, and thanks so much for listening to the Fat Burning Man Show, where we talk about real food and real results. Today's show is about one of the most popular subjects in this world of changing your relationship with food, and that is the dreaded sugar addiction. And we talk to an expert on sugar addiction, Mr. Michael Fishman, and he's a heck of a guy to boot. But before we get to the show, I just wanted to let you guys know that if you hop on over to fatburningman.com and sign up for my email list, I'll be sending a free ebook to you called The Primal Rock Stars. It features exclusive interviews with Rob Wolf, Mark Sisson, Dave Asprey, Dean Dwyer, and more. So all you have to do is head on over to fatburningman.com, sign up for the email list, and I'll shoot it over to you for free. All right, so in today's show, we talk about how Michael Fishman has struggled with a lifelong sugar craving and beaten it. We talk about why sugar is more addictive than cocaine, the spectacular difference between I can't and I don't, and why it's so dang hard to turn down a cookie. All right, let's go hang out with Michael. Michael Fishman is the founder of the Consumer Health Summit and advisor to brands and personalities on marketing and branding. With an emphasis on consumer health, the chink in his armor is a history of the dreaded sugar craving. How's it going, Michael?
Hey, good afternoon, Abel. Nice to be with you.
Thanks so much for coming on. Yeah, so why don't you just give the folks out there a brief overview of your background and also kind of some of the things that you're up to these days?
Sure. Well, I've spent the last 20-plus years advising health and wellness brands, those that market and communicate directly with consumers. Some big publishing names like Prevention and Men's Health. Mm-hmm. Also some big personalities in this space like Andrew Weil and Mark Hyman and Deepak Chopra. Advising those types of people and those types of businesses on their marketing and the way in which they're communicating with their prospects and their communities, mm-hmm. and acquiring new customers. So these days, I've been in the health and wellness space for, as I say, over 20 years. It's been my passion all the way through. Never tire of it. It really is a calling in terms of an area of the business to work in. And these days, I continue to advise and guide and consult those types of businesses. I have investments with a few as well. And I speak on consumer psychology and the way in which businesses and brands speak to their communities and the language that they use and the way in which they engage people and talk to people. So really, health and wellness are the subjects that I love personally and professionally. Marketing and specifically language and psychology and how businesses speak to their clients and customers and how the brain really comes into play in those communications is really what I'm passionate about.
I love that. That's going straight to my heart. And it seems like you use these superpowers for good, not evil, but other food manufacturers certainly can use them in a negative way.
Well, for sure, and you know from your time in that world, and certainly what I see when I look at big brands, consumer packaged goods, the companies that market foods in supermarkets, the TV commercials that we see, all the advertising that we see, and even some of the advertising we see on the web from personalities and companies in the health space. Hopefully everybody's out there with a noble mission to really help people with their health and their wellness and to be responsible for that. But mm-hmm. but the fact is that not everything out there is as useful as we might like, and in fact, some of those, some of the health solutions people are offering are actually not particularly helpful, particularly when those businesses are not purpose-driven. If they go after the marketplace as a business opportunity, sometimes people market things that they don't really believe in, but they market them anyway.
Yeah.
And we know that big food brands in the soda business or other candy business, we know that there are some conflicts of interest there as well.
So, from your perspective, when you're working with some of these folks, how do you differentiate the good guys from the bad?
Well, I'm choosy, as you are at what you do. I do have to pick my spots.
Yeah.
I think there's a vetting process that probably works as well for me as it might for a consumer or one of our listeners evaluating products or services that they want to engage in, which is to understand who the leadership or the management of the business is. If the business is a personal brand like your business, Abel, you're highly visible. There are businesses that are positioned with personalities like Martha Stewart or Oprah Winfrey or Tony Robbins or Andrew Weil.
Sure.
There are businesses that are positioned where that person is highly visible and literally their name is on the door. And then there are other kinds of businesses that are just humanized with a CEO or a leader, where that person isn't the name of the business, but they are visible around the business, like Tony Hsieh of Zappos or Howard Schultz of Starbucks or people like that. So understanding who the leaders and the managers in the business are, having access to testimonials or more rigorously said client reviews, so that there are real stories from real success stories. If there are any scientific commentary or other reporting elsewhere about that business, you can easily check via a Google search to get outside opinions about that business. Those kinds of things I think are important. And the other thing I think is that businesses that are really committed to marketing useful products, and this is really, once again, for where I pick my spots and where some of our listeners might pick their spots as consumers, an unconditional refund policy generally tells you you're working with a good company. A strong presence with customer service and a real commitment to taking phenomenally great care of customers is something. So I look for that when I choose my spots, and I think that those same kinds, that same sort of due diligence or that same sort of very readily accomplished, a little bit of digging, would help the people that are listening to us right now as well.
Yeah, and it's difficult, isn't it, as a consumer, finding a brand that you trust. I'm thinking specifically right now of Kerrygold, which is a relatively easy to find grass-fed butter, and they seem to do a great job. They just released, for example, a low-fat butter, which is not quite as high quality as the stuff that they're normally releasing. So it's a constant challenge to keep up with the brands after you've identified them, just to make sure that they're still keeping it real. What's one way that you do that, Michael?
Well, there's been lots of discussion about the use of the word natural in food marketing. Organic is relatively consistent in terms of the definition. There's not a lot of variability in organic, although the word natural doesn't really have any regulatory restrictions around it.
Right.
So it's, and certainly, foods that are advertised or labeled as low fat, you generally have higher sugar or sweetener concentrations, lots of other chemicals that replace the fat to make it equally as tasty. So it's important to understand what labels and what the language of food marketing means, as consumers.
Right.
I think that's extremely important. When we look at personalities, Abel, on your website, there's just a really super fully transparent history of who you are and where you've been educated and how you've studied and become the master educator and coach that you are. The holy grail in credentials in our space tends to be MD for medical doctor. There are great people that are not medical doctors, like chiropractors and naturopaths and other sorts of practitioners, and even people without specific professional training who nonetheless are very smart, very well intentioned, and have done amazing work in creating solutions and systems and methodologies that are extremely helpful to people. And I think one of the keys in understanding who to trust is that credibility sometimes has to do with credentials, although not every credentialed person, MD, etc., is worth working with or heeding their advice. But there are many people. The other thing about credibility is that transparency helps someone to be credible. So if someone is just fully transparent about who and what they are and who and what they're not, that's someone that you probably, can trust.
Mm-hmm.
They're great. You're not a medical doctor, but you have an unbelievable academic background, and you're very well thought out and very well researched in everything you do. Same with other friends of ours like Tim Ferriss or Chris Carr.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not always a traditional credential that it indicates the individual who can best serve you.
Yeah, and that's so interesting. And in some cases, I think that can prohibit driving forward to a certain degree. And even given my my academic education, I feel like I've needed to unlearn quite a bit of what I learned in the traditional system about nutrition, about some of the ways that the body works when I started dabbling in the fringes and looking at newer science and that sort of thing.
Sure.
And that can be dangerous waters as well, but it's definitely an unevolved journey.
Well, even as recently as 10 to 15 years ago, going out and having pasta as frequently as possible was kind of what people felt was a healthy diet.
Right.
Between the science and just the belief systems that have changed so much, and then just understanding where there are conflicts of interest that would really render recommendations questionable, like the American Dietetic Association, other organizations in the dietitian space are funded by some big food companies
Mm-hmm.
whose products have preservatives and chemicals and high fructose corn syrup and all those sorts of things. So, so as an example, I was just reading yesterday, there's a movement in the community of dietitians to create, really some guidelines for integrity.
Mm.
So between the science changing, the beliefs, even among the most well-researched and the most well-intentioned doctors and researchers, and then just where there are conflicts of interest, there really still is a fair amount to navigate.
Yeah, there is. That's why it's important to have a group of people who you trust. But at the same time, like I was saying right before our call, or right before our interview, Michael, it's sometimes that can become very incestuous. Like, for example, the ancestral health community. Everyone kind of knows what everyone else is talking about and start squabbling about the details, things about like whether a starch is safe or not, and the little ratios between omega-3 and omega-6s, for example, and what is optimal. Meanwhile, 99% of the world or of the country certainly, is suffering by eating food that is not appropriate for their body. So I think something that that I'm sure the folks that you work with, when they're developing these brands of integrity, they can kind of help push that toward the mainstream, right? Push these fringe ideas toward the average Joe or Jane.
I think we see that, and I think, what was fringe, 6 months ago, next year can be mainstream, and,
right.
and sometimes it depends on what is the marketing muscle and what are the platforms by which this solution or the new system has been publicized, discussed. If something goes into a very big venue like the Dr. Oz show or the Today Show or the Huffington Post or those sorts of outlets, those sorts of outlets can take a new discovery or a new way of looking at things, quite far.
Yeah.
But the other thing is that any of these sorts of things, when presented to the consumer marketplace, I assume as a marketer, as an investor in some of these kinds of businesses that offer health solutions to the consumer market, I assume that we're talking to a smart marketplace.
Mm-hmm.
People. This conversation, this language, the sorts of awareness around health and wellness and what's good for you, are really very much in the mainstream. Virtually anybody, in America, regardless of their prior participation with health publications or anything, virtually everybody could name one thing they could start doing and one thing they could stop doing to improve their health and wellness virtually immediately.
Sure.
So everybody has enough knowledge to take a few steps. So in some respects, knowledge isn't necessarily, it's good to have the best, most helpful knowledge. But in another way of looking at it, the absence of knowledge and information isn't so much the problem as people feeling, having the ownership and the responsibility to have a great life and to have a healthy, container, meaning their physical body.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes the problem can be an overabundance of information and misinformation.
Right, without a doubt. And the other thing, Abel, about new solutions, new discoveries, what you mentioned as things that originate on the fringe, is that there is always and this goes back to what I was saying about my assumption that I speak to a smart, relatively well-educated market.
Mm-hmm.
Even so, it's important that businesses describe what it is they want people to understand in simple terms.
Yeah.
So that it is inclusive and does touch and is understandable by everybody in the marketplace, no matter what their education level and no matter their background. Businesses spend so much time doing backflips and like tap dancing. Businesses spend so much time trying to be understood by people in the marketplace,
mm-hmm.
but they don't necessarily spend a lot of time helping the marketplace, helping people in the market feel understood by them, right?
Yeah.
So it's helpful and even compassionate to speak to the marketplace in a way that they can understand. And so a fringe idea, a new solution, a breakthrough idea is best communicated in ways that people can fully understand from wherever their whatever their background is.
Yeah.
And that makes it accessible and understandable to the broadest possible slice of the audience and gives it the opportunity to expand, I think, more quickly than it otherwise might.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about a specific example from your life. Sugar. This is a really interesting one because I think if you ask almost anyone out there whether or not sugar is good for you, they'll all say no. Sugar is not good for you. Sugar makes you fat. It's not rocket science. But
right.
At the same time, when they're reaching for low-fat foods, what inevitably happens when you take out the fat is food manufacturers tend to try to add some semblance of flavor, and so in doing so, they add usually chemicals or kind of non-foods, and they up the sugar. So those little 100-calorie packs or the 100-calorie yogurts that are without fat all of a sudden have tons of sugar in them, yet they're supposed to be more healthy than the high-fat, low-sugar yogurt.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
That's kind of a fascinating thing in the background of all this, but everyone, almost everyone out there has sugar cravings, and I know that's something that you've been struggling with over the course of time. So can you explain your journey as it relates to that?
Sure. Well, I think there are lots of foods that people, foods and also food components, ingredients like caffeine and sugar and gluten and so forth, that people consume over time. Some of these things, sugar is probably a good example. If it was introduced to the marketplace today, there are many doctors who say the odds of sugar passing, FDA approval as a new product today would be virtually impossible. But it's like the horses have been out of the barn for generations on sugar. It's just out there.
Yeah.
But for me, I have a sweet tooth. That's just how that is.
Mm-hmm.
And many years ago, I stopped sugar for a period of months. But it's always been on my mind that sugar has me, I don't have it.
Mm-hmm.
However you want to language it, I could say I've empowered this substance, or it has me, but it feels like an addiction. We look at heroin and even alcohol and things that are in the general conversation. There are commonly acknowledged addictions, but I think sugar is a very addictive substance. Mm-hmm. Many scientists have demonstrated how it's more addictive than cocaine even. And so I really just decided to take on sugar head on after many years of false starts and certainly being aware of my connection to sugar. Now, once again, I don't add sugar to drinks. I don't, there's a lot of ways I don't consume sugar. Table sugar I've never really used. But every day I would want something sweet. Even if there wasn't something in the house, I'd get in the car and go get it. And so I knew that when the car felt like it was steering itself to the cookie store,
I've been there.
That was, at some point that just became unacceptable to me. And really the kicker for me was, as you know, I lead an annual discussion group, an invitational event called the Consumer Health Summit for health and wellness leaders like yourself. And I've been doing that for about 15 years. And even though I'm healthy and not obese, I really was just raising the bar on myself in terms of being a congruent and effective leader of that event in the health and wellness space. So I thought, okay, last year before the May 2012 event, I gave myself a 60-day period of time leading up to that event where I would drop sugar, gluten, caffeine, and alcohol, all four.
Wow.
And also exercise daily for that period of time, and which for me was a 5.5-mile walk.
Okay.
And so I nailed that 60 days with more ease than I ever could have envisioned. And actually caffeine I had stopped 5 months prior after hearing Dr. Daniel Amen talk about caffeine. I just stopped. That was a mere formality for me. Many people struggle with caffeine. For me, that was a formality because I would have a half a cup in the morning maybe.
Mm-hmm.
If no one made coffee, I didn't even think about it. So I just stopped coffee. That was just a formality for me, and I haven't had it in a year and a half now.
Mm-hmm.
Gluten, while you have to be rigorous about it and just be aware of what you're eating and what's around, that also wasn't too tough at all.
Mm-hmm.
Alcohol I went from maybe 3 or 4 glasses of wine per week to a cold turkey stop, and now with alcohol I allow maybe 2 to 3 glasses per month.
Okay.
Because it's not a trigger substance for me.
Yeah.
So I can have a glass and then not think about it for weeks, and that's okay.
Right.
But sugar was the number one sort of demon ingredient that just really had me. And and so now, just in a few weeks from now, it'll be a year.
Congratulations! That's amazing.
Oh, thank you. I consider it one of the great accomplishments of my life, even though there have been many others that we might consider, make me successful in business or relationships or whatever. As a parent, but beating sugar is one of the real, sort of things I've conquered that really stands out for me.
Mm-hmm.
And the interesting thing is that, you could probably describe this better than I can. I think any of these substances, within hours or certainly a few days, are out of your system, and there's a restoration of chemical equilibrium in your body within a few days of being without these substances. But the brain really calls for it for a much longer period of time in terms of the memory of that experience, whatever the brain science is around this. So it took 5 or 6 months for my brain to stop clamoring and giving me every excuse and story in the book to get me to crack.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of how it went down. For me, where willpower had previously failed, or really just a commitment to my own health and wellness, which is massive, didn't really do the trick on this very addictive substance, and yet externalizing it into a goal to lead this event, with congruence, was what for the first time, had me stick to a commitment that was a 60-day commitment, and now just about to hit 1 year.
That's amazing. And sugar is such a pernicious substance, isn't it? It's something that, as many people joke about it being addictive, it really is for almost everyone out there. I can't think of anything else that's really like that.
Well, I think it's as I mentioned, I think it's one of these substances that is completely well established in our culture, to say the least. And so we allow it to persist as this massively addictive substance that, it's like the emperor's new clothes. We don't talk about it, so like a sweet tooth is just sort of this thing we chuckle about.
Right.
But, somebody had a heroin tooth, we get real concerned about that. Then, and because sugar doesn't necessarily change your state of mind it might at some level create hyperactivity for kids, or there may be some subtle mental and cognitive impact, but because sugar doesn't make you high, so to speak, and it doesn't make you a reckless driver, enables you to keep working, and you retain your basic functionality even when you're eating sugar all day long, and so we just allow it. We just endure. As a culture, we allow it to be. But it's a massively addictive substance. And as I said, the first 5 or 6 months, even beyond the point where it was well out of my system, it's just phenomenal the tricks the brain will play to get you to crack and go back. And it gives me a lot of empathy and identification with people who do beat some of the harder addictive substances that we really that we as a culture look down on. I mean, and some of which are criminally, that are against the law to even possess or use.
Right.
But I totally get what the brain does to get people to go back to those substances. It's very compelling.
Yeah, and I think wired into our own psychology as well is to, demonize the things that are acutely damaging, like heroin, as an example. Whereas something like sugar, since you don't get high, it's not acutely damaging, although I guess you could argue that it is, but not obviously so. It's one of those things where you can kind of look at it and, over the course of time, it's infinitely damaging to people. But because we're so wired up for instant gratification or like noticing something that happens acutely, it's something that kind of goes under the radar. Yeah.
Well, look, we know that precancerous cells and cancerous cells, love sugar. We know that sugar destroys collagen in terms of the structure and the integrity of the skin and youthful skin. We know, of course, that sugar has a direct relationship with insulin metabolism and ultimately fat preservation in the body, which once again you could detail far better than I can. But the ways in which sugar contributes to the generation and preservation of fat in the body, even more so than animal proteins, is very well established. So it's tough stuff. It really is.
It is. So let's define sugar in your case. What are you avoiding, and what gets a pass?
Well, it's interesting, and it's just funny because I get that question from just about everybody that knows about this, and for me, it's not only is it sugar, but it's anything sweet like honey, agave, molasses, maple syrup, and of course artificial sweeteners, which I've never consumed anyway. I've never been a diet soda guy. But really any sweetener, because for me a sweet taste, if I'm having honey or agave or maple syrup, now I want a brownie, So, and I'm not into substitutes that taste or feel like the real thing but aren't the real thing, even if they're safe. So I stay away from sweetness. Other than what I do allow myself is fresh fruit.
Okay.
For a while, I was actually, allowing myself to have dried fruit. But I stopped that just because I realized that dry fruit is kind of a trigger food for me. Like I'll just overeat. Like I'll really want to just gorge on like apricots or raisins or something. Mm-hmm. I realized whoa, and of course dried fruit is kind of a power hit of sugar, even though it's natural sugar. So I actually thought, wow, these foods, apricots and raisins and so forth, dried apples, mango, etc. This feels like an Oreo. This is like, it's got me. I don't have it because if I touch it, I go through the whole package.
Right.
So I actually used the muscle I had built from stopping sugar and gluten, etc. And I said, okay, I'm not eating dried fruit, and that was that. And that's been 6 weeks ago. Mm-hmm. So I find that the muscle, if you will, that I built from having been able to put aside this extremely addictive food ingredient called sugar, it helped me build a muscle to actually say no to other things much more quickly and much more sustainably.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, I think conquering weight or conquering a particular food addiction or something like that, and sustaining it, I think, and I know you have experienced this, and many of our friends and listeners will have experienced this. Once you kick something, once you beat something like that and sustain it, it actually gives you the ability and the muscle to affect change elsewhere in your life, virtually any kind of change, through your experience of yourself as something like your relationship to yourself is that you trust yourself.
Yeah.
And that you do, like, your word is your bond, even when your word is with yourself. You can make promises to others and keep those promises, and then you can make promises with yourself. So there is food is a real yardstick of your relationship with yourself. And to manage food in a way that's healthful, and even to stop consuming certain ingredients or components of food, I think it's my experience that I've been able to develop this muscle around changing any sorts of other things just because I've demonstrated to myself that I can do it.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? And it's almost like a contagious process. I've found for me, a lot of what has changed my life ultimately was changing my relationship with food. And that started with nutrition. And it was, a lot of people out there know my story, but just briefly, I was okay as a teenager, but the way that I was eating, which is supposedly healthy, low fat, high carb, and exercising a lot. Every time I went to the doctor, I was a little fatter, a little sicker, and supposedly supposed to take one more medication that was on a rapidly building list. When I started really researching this stuff to death, and I guess reversed my thinking about what I thought I knew, based on my doctor's recommendations, based on conventional wisdom, what the commercials tell you to do, what the magazines tell you to do. Once I kind of abandoned that and did a 180 and my health turned around, I thought, well, what other myths are out there about exercise, for example? And then I kind of tackled that, and I'm like, wow, this is nothing like what I was taught in gym class, that running longer will get you leaner and more fit, for example. Turns out the body just doesn't work that way. And then I started applying that framework of what else do I think is true that is actually not to life in general and business. And my life has completely changed since that first, I guess, building of the muscle when it came to food.
Right. And congratulations to you on all of that as well.
Thanks, Michael. But how can people out there, number one, begin the process of cutting sugar out of their diets, for example, and how do you sustain that?
Yeah, well, I'm not a psychology professional, but what worked for me was because look, as I said, I have a strong commitment to health, wellness, and living the longest, most vital life I can, and I'm an example of somebody with massive amounts of access to information, a lot of which I read and understand. So that it wasn't a lack of commitment, and it wasn't a lack of education or information. Mm-hmm. For me, what enabled me to do it was to pick an external target, meaning the 60 days up until my leadership of this health and wellness conference for business leaders, and that event in itself is a huge, long-standing commitment for me. 14 years at this point. So, wow. Just for me, that was something that really delivered the result. And what I think the key there is that it takes willpower out of the game in a way, because systems and external commitments really do trump willpower, because the brain will crush willpower most of the time.
Yeah.
But if you can take, just the simple, exercise of willpower out of the equation and pick an external target. Look, for some men and women, that's their wedding date. We hear that all the time. I want to get into my tux, I want to get into my dress, whatever that might be. But those sorts of things, I think, have a fairly good track record. And the point is, and the point there is that to pick something, and then when you hit that 30 or 60 days from now, whatever it might be, that's not the end of the story. Because left to your own devices, your brain and your body and your historic habits will take you right back to where you were, and that is also fairly predictable.
Mm-hmm.
So it's also the language that you assign to this process. It is not a diet, in terms of a short-lived like exercise and deprivation, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So number one, take out willpower. Number two, I think you'd agree, take out deprivation.
Mm-hmm.
And the way in which we language and label and characterize these processes, I think, has a lot to do with their success. It's like, well, this is how I live. This is now how I live.
Yeah.
For me, I can't envision the reintroduction of sugar, because I think as a sugar addict, if I don't have sugar for the next 40 years, in 40 years I'll still tell you I'm a sugar addict.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's important to pick a target in the near term, let's say in the next 60 to 90 days, stick to it, and at that point, at least for me, there's been a total shift in my experience of those foods or food ingredients. There's been a total shift in terms of my desire to have those things. I still want brownies and ice cream and all that stuff, but it's no longer pulling and begging me to have it, in terms of the experience in my mind and my brain. And I'm not going to say it's effortless, but it's 100 times easier than it was, just a few months ago.
Yeah, and so I think you touched upon this, most people think when they cut sugar, for example, it's an exercise of deprivation. So how do you take something like that and turn it in a positive direction? Yeah.
Well, the giving the body the nutrients that it really needs, is a big part of that. I mean, as a nation, we're overfed but undernourished.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, yes. I mean, there are people in our country that do not have enough food, and that's a very sad circumstance. But what I'm referring to is people that have plenty of foods, but it's all the wrong foods, and so obesity and undernourishment go hand in hand much of the time. That's I forget exactly where I was going, but that's something that we see that's something we see quite a bit. And so nourishing your body with what we call whole foods, with proteins and vegetables and those sorts of things, once you've actually beaten the addiction or the habitual nature of whether it's sugar or caffeine or alcohol or whatever it is that engages people at that level, giving your body the nutrients that it really needs is something that quells those desires quite a bit.
Right. And I was talking to a few other folks about this recently. For you, keeping up this change, I think accountability is built in because a lot of people know that this is what you're up to, cutting these things out of your diet. But even more than that, the longer that you do it, the more it becomes a part of your identity.
Yeah, that's 100% true. I mean, I go on Facebook. I mean, that's some of the major milestones. 60 days, 6 months, 100 days, 200 days, whatever those big round numbers are. But I'll go on Facebook and say it's been 200 days, and I'll get 30 comments, and yes, the comments feel good, and everybody's congratulating me and patting me on the back. But really, what that's about is me being accountable in public.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm going to town square, and I'm getting up on the box, and I'm saying, I am committed to this, and I've done it for 200 days, and I'm not going to stop. So in 10 days or whatever it is, I'm going to go on there and say it's been a year, and there's going to be a whole ton of comments, and that will be nourishing, but it isn't the point.
Yeah.
point is to be accountable to a community. And that's a great point that you bring up, Abel, and super helpful is that you want to be publicly accountable. And that will provide a structure, kind of a psychological structure. It's not a physical. We're not talking about walls and stuff, but provide like a structure in your mind inside of which you can live, and that that accountability and honoring your word and honoring the expectation, whether you share it with 2 people or 200 or 2,000. That's an accountability that will help you really stay on the rails in those moments where it feels like it's hard.
Yeah, and it's definitely hard at the beginning of the process. I'm sure you encountered this where you're just sitting at a party or something like that, and someone's like, "Oh, have a cookie," and you're like, "Sorry, I'm not doing that right now. Cookies don't fit into what I'm doing," and they're like, "Oh, why?" And then you explain it to them, and then they don't really accept it. It puts them in a negative mindset because it kind of threatens their behavior, right, and their choices. You rejecting their cookie is saying that the way that they're living is wrong in some way, or at least that's kind of the social dynamic that's going on. But over the course of time, that say a year later, you're at the same party, they might not offer you that cookie, and so that whole thing is avoided just because you're a healthy guy at that point. It's not some weird thing you're doing.
Yeah, I've seen that. I mean, I host a dinner in New York City every month, co-host with a friend for business leaders, and we're at the same table at the same restaurant every month, and even the serving staff knows to not put the bread on my plate. So it's a great point. People stop offering you the stuff that they know you're off. And even the way you language it for yourself, instead of saying, "I can't eat that bread" or "I can't have that dessert," that frames it in like it's a prohibited thing. Mm-hmm. It's this taboo, prohibitive thing, as opposed to a choice for life and a choice for health. So it's a simple no thank you.
Yeah.
Or if people really feel the need to expand, or even in your your relationship to yourself is the number one relationship to honor here. Mm-hmm. It's not that I can't, it's just that I don't.
Yeah, exactly, and that's the healthy way of looking at it.
Yeah, it's a huge distinction and a huge difference. I don't eat cookies anymore.
Right.
That's a lot easier for me to accept and live with than I can't eat cookies anymore.
Yeah. I love that. When I hear you say that, I don't eat cookies anymore, it fills me up with kind of a positive feeling. Because I experience the same thing. If I see Oreos or M&Ms just lying out on the table, it's not like I avoid them. I'm not drawn to them anymore because it's not a part of who I am. It's a choice that I've made, and now it's just automatic.
Right. I don't is a choice you make. I can't is some external force or person is prohibiting you from doing it.
Yeah.
So there's always going to be resistance to I can't, because that takes us back to psychological memory and mental memory in childhood and growing up and all the million times we were told no. Mm-hmm. Right? So there's no reason to battle with yourself in terms of psychological history and the thousands of times you were told no between the ages of like 0 and 18, you know. But to make your own choice is, I just don't do that, and then that is not externalized. That comes from within you in service to yourself. Right. I haven't even I thank you. Really, our dynamic right here just generated that distinction. I haven't thought about that before, but I just got something big for myself just talking about that with you.
That's part of the fun. I can't believe it, but we're just about out of time, Michael. This is just breezed right by. But why don't you tell the folks out there where they can find you and what you're working on?
Sure. I typically have two or three consulting assignments at any given time, always in health and wellness, and usually with a web-based company. And that sometimes those are personal brands like yourself, or sometimes companies in the supplement space or in the publishing space. So michaelfishmanconsulting.com is my site, and there's a pretty easy opt-in form there if you'd like further insights from me. on an occasional basis. That's where I do my communicating, and I'm also on Twitter at Michael Fishman, my name, and I'm usually posting things there as well. I think I have like 9,000 tweets. I don't think I've ever made one request of anybody. I just really try to have it be about generosity, contribution, and giving people good insights and good resources. So those are the two places.
All right. I love it. Well, Michael, thank you so much for coming on. This has been really valuable. Sugar addiction is something that so many people out there struggle with, and I think this has been really helpful for them.
This was a total treat. This was the sweetest part of my day. So thank you so much, Abel. This is fantastic. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael. If you'd like to hear more from Michael Fishman, you can check out his website at michaelfishmanconsulting.com. And once again, don't forget to sign up for my email list at fatburningman.com, and I'll shoot you a free ebook called The Primal Rockstars, as well as some free audio and exclusive video and other cool stuff. All you have to do is go to fatburningman.com and sign up for the email list, and I'll shoot it right over to you. I just want to remind you that I really appreciate you listening and telling your friends about the show. We've been kicking butt recently, and I look forward to keeping that up. So tell your friends and drop me a line anytime. Love hearing from you guys. Now, until next week, be well. I'll be talking to you guys soon. Cheers.